The reproductive health community, you all know, stands at a crossroads, right? And this ambitious objective that was reached at the London Summit in 2012, 120 million additional women would be reached by 2020. And that's a daunting goal, right? And there are lots of challenges in the way. And so to get, while substantial progress has been made to date, clearly you all are here to figure out how you can redouble those efforts and get these supplies to the women and families who are in such desperate need. So this meeting obviously is set up to talk about how the reproductive health community can do that. So oftentimes an outside perspective is needed, and that's what I've had the pleasure of learning over the last 10 years, that we can learn from each other, even when we think that I'm not sure, they're not gonna have that much to offer. And I know in the global health community, we often look at multinationals like Starbucks, like Expeditors, and like Microsoft, and think, oh my gosh, they've got all the money in the world. They've got all the resources they need. They can't possibly imagine what it's like for us in the real world, in the trenches, and the challenges that we face. And I think you'll hear today that there are ways that we can learn and share, and so the panelists today are gonna help us with that. So I'm gonna ask them some questions to begin with, and then we'll go with some questions. Well, about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience, and then you can hopefully follow up with them on the break as well. And so I know you've got biographies, I believe, and so I'm not going to get into all of the details, right? So so we can get right into the conversation. So apologies to those of you over here because I'm not going to be able to see you, but I'll stand up when it's question time. But I'm going to disappear behind the podium now. I know you'll miss me. Okay, so first of all, to my far right is Angela Hession, and she works with Microsoft. And next to her is John Dew from Expeditors. And I will also say that John, a year ago, joined the Village Reach Board, and I think the scales have fallen from his eyes, and he said it's just such a completely different world, and so I know he's going to really be able to talk about what he's learned over the last few years. Next we have Lauren Acoba from Starbucks, mother-to-be, and Samson Fanta from Microsoft is right here on my right. And one thing I was thinking about when Deborah called and asked me to do this panel, I remember also about 10 years ago, there was a meeting in London for the Pacific Health Summit that used to be put on by the Gates Foundation. And they brought in companies to be part of the conversation. And I remember the senior vice president from Coca-Cola stood up at one point. We were having this conversation about public-private partnerships and how we need to do this together. And he stood up and he said, I want to help, I really do, but I have no idea what you guys are talking about. This is a different language for me. And so I would ask us, I'm going to try to, we've had a lot of conversations ahead of time, and we'll be careful of our language today, but if there's something that doesn't feel right, just let me know. I mean, I'm going to try to, let's make sure we're understanding and speaking the same language as we move along. So I'm hopeful that we'll do that. But if something comes up as we're talking, raise your hand so we can make sure that we clarify. Okay, let's not waste this opportunity while we have these wonderful people up here. So I'm going to start with the critical question that is on my mind, and I alluded to a little bit, I would imagine is on other people's mind. I mean, what are we going to learn from you, these huge multinationals, where you do have more resources, you do have more capacity to adjust, and you don't work on, well, I would say tight margins is an understatement, right? And so the people in this room are working with failing electricity, broken communications, subpar infrastructure, everything you can imagine, and many things that you can't. So, Samson, I want to start with you, and let's talk about your experience in Microsoft. I know you have some examples about how you face some of these challenges and a little bit about what you've done about it.
Sure. Yeah, one of the examples I can think of is just supply disruptions in general. So over 70% of Fortune 500 companies have at least one supply disruption a year. And the cost is pretty significant. Per supply disruption, it's over $3 billion that it costs for the market cap of that company, right? So it's pretty significant magnitude. When you think of supply disruptions, it could be things that are non-controllable, natural disasters. It could be government agencies. One of them that we just experienced about 4 weeks ago, and many companies experienced it, is one of our key suppliers went bankrupt, right? So Hession is one of the biggest inbound logistics providers, and when they went bankrupt, a lot of companies had containers under Hession's control, right? So for us, how we dealt with this or mitigated it, I don't think anybody can say they solved the problem. We all dealt with it. And then just keep in mind, I'm in the hardware business, so although it's Microsoft and it's a big company, we don't have a high profit margin on hardware. Many companies don't, right? So we ship ocean. We don't want to ship air. We want to make sure we're profitable. So when this happened, we'd learned from other experiences we had. So they'd been on a watch list for us. We knew that there were some difficulties that they were having, and we slowly started to divest from them earlier, prior to them going bankrupt. But when it happened, we still were impacted, right? And first thing we did is we used as much information to identify how many containers were impacted, where they were, and how bad really was it. We had to quantify. That's like the most important thing, I think, anytime you're dealing with these kind of big issues like that. So quantify it, and then we met with the executives at Hession, and then we wanted to understand what's the impact for our other companies and our peer industry companies. So we do have relationships where we can talk to our, in some cases, competitors, but you don't share confidential information, and you have the dialogue to understand, because we're all affected, right? So that partnership does help, and it really helped when we started looking at mitigations and other suppliers. We noticed that they knew what was going on. They tripled their rates in some cases, right? They wanted to take advantage, and what we were able to do is leverage these partnerships we had with these companies and understand who are they doing this to, and how can we really call their bluff and tell them, you know what, it's not going to work, and you should partner with us. So that was one thing, and another issue we dealt with. So we were able to mitigate that. We had certain ports that are unionized where they said they didn't think that they would get paid by Hession, and they were not going to move their containers at all. So LA, Long Beach is a perfect example. You're talking hundreds of containers that are just frozen there. And what we had to do is, again, leverage our partnerships we had. We're part of this National Retailer Association, and we were able to meet together and use our influence to work with the unionized port workers and get them to start working on the containers and slowly start releasing it. It wasn't as fast as we would have liked, right? But they weren't able to just stop it. Yeah. So I think those are the things that we were able to do.
So that combining forces often with competitors to actually address the problem together.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
So Lauren, Starbucks works in a lot of the countries that we all work in, and I know that you've had some interesting experiences there on the milk supply chain and some things we wouldn't necessarily expect. So can you describe?
Yeah, so Perry mentioned this, but if you think about Starbucks, as much as we are a coffee company, we're also a dairy company. So 60% of our beverages have milk in them. And when I think about working under constraints, one of the things that comes to mind is our goal to double the store count and the store growth in China over the next couple of years. And when we think about the US, the dairy, we have a lot of dairies, and the infrastructure already exists where we're doing daily deliveries of liquid pasteurized milk to both urban and rural areas. When we think about China, that doesn't exist. So even if we have all the money in the world, that it's not there, right? And we're not the experts in dairy supply chain. And often we actually contract out a lot of our warehousing and transportation. So as we looked at that in the China Asia Pacific market, one of the things we thought about is how can we can't sell a latte without a form of dairy, right? Powder and aseptic is something that is fairly common in China, Asia Pacific, and there is actually a market for it. It has a longer shelf life. You can actually store it. And so some of the constraints we face, like distance to customer and just literally availability of that liquid supply, we were able to overcome with that. I think the other thing is demand for milk in China is a lot higher than the supply. And so how are we, with limited resources in supply chain, I mean, we're asked to cut our budget every single year, but also grow and double our business. How do we put, the limited investment that we have into something that's going to make the biggest impact? So one of the things we've done is look at buying ahead and kind of hedging our risk by purchasing and securing a price out into the future for that aseptic milk in the dairy in China, Asia Pacific markets. And so although we're paying a slight premium, it protects us from some of these larger 3 billion, that Samson had mentioned, stockouts that are a much, hopefully they don't happen, but really ensuring availability of supply is a lot more beneficial in the long run than paying a slight premium up front to ensure that availability.
Right, and I want to come back also in a bit to the Costa Rica story as well.
Yeah.
But John, I know you've got some examples that are even more stark than this. So with Expeditors, and for people who don't know, why don't you just explain? Because Starbucks and Microsoft are common names, but say quickly what Expeditors is, and then would you talk about some of the challenges?
Thank you. Expeditors is a multinational global logistics company. We provide ocean services across the globe, air services, trucking, distribution, insurance, and logistics consulting services as well. In relationship to your question, we as a transportation company or a logistics company, we have to design our network to meet very specific customer needs. It's not necessarily cookie cutter. What we do for pharmaceuticals is going to be a lot different than what we do for retail or for garment manufacturers or auto supply dealers. So we have to adapt a network that meets their needs across, obviously, the globe, with many disruptions that occur, whether they're man-made through strikes or weather delays or some type of natural disaster. That network has to be nimble and move very quickly. But getting back to maybe some of the ideas in terms of solutions and how we address them, I really look back at the way the customer has come to the industry in general with needs. A perfect example is the garment industry. In many cases, they have, at the point of manufacture, the ability to put on hangers the garments with tags, on hangers, on racks, so they move from China to New York and go right to the store floor without any handling in between. That's a model that I think is not necessarily cookie cutter for the aid world, but you may be able to adapt that concept to what you're doing for reproductive supplies or immunization. How can the point of manufacturing help you with the final delivery? And there are many ideas, I think, coming from this group in terms of the panel that come from the traditional logistics world that may not necessarily be cookie cutter for what I would call the extreme logistics world, the world that has to deal in very extreme circumstances. But you could adopt these models and I think help that supply chain.
So, often a technology or a drug or even a program to get that to the community, that last mile, as we call it, is if you can get it there, then it's not adopted in the way that you had imagined. Certainly not in the way you imagined, or sometimes not at all, despite best examples. So, Angela, can you give us an example of a time when you experienced supply chain hiccups and what you did about them? I'm sure there's none of that, but actually, Angela was telling me that this has been sort of difficult for her to think about because she didn't want to remember some of it. She's had bad dreams.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, it's an honor to be here. So I'm hoping that we can share some of our stories and learnings with you. The example that I was speaking to Lisa about was, I think the constraint that we all work in, especially in supply chain, is that we're mitigating the risk of a lot of the challenges or issues upstream. So it can be who's manufacturing, et cetera. And we're always asked to do it with less money and faster. So sometimes we're short-sighted in our analysis. So the example that I was sharing with Lisa was there's free trade zones across different geographies, and they sound great when you look at them because you're saving money in the short term. Well, we decided to do this in the Amazon for one of our manufacturing locations and distributions. And I have spent some time in Latin America, and I wasn't sure it was the best idea, but it was saving us probably about 30% on manufacturing costs. And as Samson alluded, we don't make a lot of money on hardware. In fact, we usually sell our hardware at a loss, to be honest with you. And we went ahead and we started this manufacturing location in Amazon, in the middle of the Amazon. It was great. All the products was manufactured. The problem was we didn't think about the infrastructure of how to get the product out of Amazon. So you're in Manaus, in the center of the jungle, a great manufacturing facility, very cheap, but the roads actually to distribute this product across Latin America was extremely challenging. And if you've ever commuted within Latin America, even on a plane, usually sometimes the best option is to fly back to Miami and then fly to the other country, having done it several times. So I think the constraint or some of the challenges that we've had is just making sure you're looking at the full picture. And just the learning here is we ended up shutting that manufacturing location down, even though we did initially save money, it ended up costing us money. And that's a constraint that we learned the hard way from, is that making sure you're thinking about scale and the long term, not just the short-term realization of the cost savings.
And another thing is, as we all were talking in advance of this panel, often it came, you all talked about what you've learned about addressing customer demand and calling customer back, right? And having that drive what you're doing and how you approach it. So, John, why don't you talk about how Expeditors accommodates that, and then I want to hear from Samson as well.
It's an interesting concept where orders are received by us very early on, whether that be in retail or in some cases autos or pharmaceuticals, 6 months out. So we're able to get visibility of what is going to be coming out of the factories throughout various countries. We can start pre-planning when those shipments will arrive. Optimizing container utilization. We can hold back shipments until the other shipments actually come in and hold that shipment until you get a full container load to maximize that unit cost across the globe. Retailers in particular like to change the orders. Remember, they're putting orders out 6 months out. You may not have a cold spell in Chicago. That cold spell may be further back east. So by that time that container starts transiting across the water, they're starting to adjust those orders to where those needs are. So they get really an accurate reflection of where that demand is going to be, and that supply marries up with the demand in an optimal way. So this concept of order management is both from a transportation provider perspective as well as the technology. There's the technology providers are out there developing tools to capture the order, to marry it up with the transportation, the logistics information, to give basically the end user the maximum visibility to where these shipments are and the ability to adjust those shipments upon need, which is a tremendously valuable concept for many, many companies in trying to control cost.
So Samson, I know that this is something that you all are looking at, and so talk about how Microsoft's doing that, and then think about it in terms of, the folks in this room don't have the teams to actually figure out often, there are a lot of challenges to figuring out what the customer really wants, what the end user will use. So,
no, absolutely. What we've done, so in certain cases where you can't wait for an order and you can't truly build to order, what we do is postpone it. So until the last minute, have it as just a general product that doesn't have any customization, anything like that. You delay it, you have it at a central hub somewhere. By that time, you have orders, you have an idea of how you can configure that product. And so you delay that final configuration until the last minute, and then at that point, when you get that customer order, or even if you just have a better idea of the customer demand, it doesn't need to be an order. It's just, we thought we were going to make 20% of this, but now we really need, 10%. And then you can make those changes there. You avoid some of the cost of having it fully built coming out of the manufacturing facility. So just delaying that final configuration until the last moment where you know you have a product that has a high demand variability is something we've done. And it's been a learning experience. We didn't just think about this and then do some data analytics and then just get it done. There was definitely growing pains. You have excess, you have shortages, but it's how do you take those lessons and then understand how moving forward you can delay that configuration in a way to avoid those from happening again.
And Lauren, I know that you all talk about this in terms of economies of scale and how you use that. And I don't know whether it's an option for the collective group here. It's hard for individual NGOs, but could you talk about how you all address this?
Yeah, absolutely. So and I'm part of food at Starbucks specifically right now, and one of our goals is to essentially double food in the next couple of years. And we don't necessarily have that scale, that supplier infrastructure built out. And so as we started to grow food, one of the things that we started to think about was with these increasing cost pressures and really high cost of goods sold and lower margins on our product, how can we reduce those costs? And we worked with several suppliers, and really each of those suppliers might be buying flour, they might be buying butter, they might be buying salt, and although they're not, they're in business with us, they're not necessarily in business with each other. But we started thinking about how can we leverage our partnership with them and start to get them collaborating with each other, and also leverage our economies of scale and that volume. We're all going for the same, ultimately the same goal, to contract and actually commit to those second tier ingredients like flour and sugar together. Because together, those volumes are a lot larger and we have a little bit more leverage to reduce cost. So that's something we've kind of started down in this journey, the path. I think for us, we have limited resources and personnel, and our systems don't always connect and talk. So one of the learnings out of that was, yes, we were able to have some cost savings, and we're like, this is great. But we don't have the infrastructure or personnel to actually manage that. So we're taking on additional liability and risk, but oftentimes we don't have the people or the systems that are integrated fully to the end to manage that. So that's something that we're continuing to build out.
I'm sure that sounds a little bit familiar to most of the people in this room. So we've all got to work with partners in this process, right? Which can be fabulous, or it can not be so great. And so manufacturers, governments at the country and community level, transporters, warehouses, other NGOs in our cases. So what are some of the practical ways your company has partnered with developing country partners and to address specifically around outstanding supplies issues? So Angela, why don't you talk about what you've done in Latin America?
So a positive approach. So I was Microsoft with our supply chain. We're still evolving and doing best practices and learning as we go. What we have decided, and I think it's great that we realized, is that we are not the subject matter experts of logistics and distribution in Latin America. Originally, we owned our own facilities, we managed them, and we actually ran into a lot of challenges because there's local cultural norms that we weren't aware of. So even though something says on a piece of paper on a trade document of doing something that you need to do to ship a product across borders is not necessarily what's on the paper, it's how you do it. And one of the best experiences we had, especially for Latin America, was we outsourced to a company that had the expertise in that region. At first, we used them more as a vendor relationship, so we didn't share a lot of what we were doing with them or what our strategy was. And so it was a little rocky at first because we were holding back a lot of our information, especially when you're launching new products and you may be leveraging partners that are also with your competitor. It was, we missed a step. I think there's information you can still share with your partners, so and you bring them to the table as a partner and not as a vendor. And that was a strategic shift actually for Microsoft across our supply chain. We always thought, well, we will tell you how we want you to do something. And instead, bringing them to the table, there's a lot of great strategy and ideas that we're missing. They're the subject matter experts, and we're not leveraging their knowledge to help us be better for our customers. So I think that the two takeaways for me was that not to treat our partners as vendors, and then also leverage the expertise in the region when you realize that is not what your expertise is.
So, Lauren, I know you have something.
Yeah, I absolutely can identify with that. I think about one of the huge supply constraints we've faced over the last several years at Starbucks is a decline in coffee production. So coffee production has reached its lowest in 45 years. And especially, advanced in the last 10 years due to climate change, specifically in the Central America region. And that's a problem for us. We're not the only player in coffee. There's a lot of different players in coffee, but ultimately we have the same goal, and we want the health of that industry to be good. And so about 3 years back, we bought a farm in Costa Rica. So obviously we can't change everything globally, but what can we do, right? And so we bought a farm in Costa Rica. One of our core competencies is really agronomy. So we've turned it into kind of a world, like a global agronomy and research center. And some of the people that work on our team are looking at how do they build varietals that are of trees that are rust resistant. So the main decline is really because of this, what we call coffee rust, which essentially can just destroy a crop over time. So how do we build trees that are resistant to rust? The problem is we want to get these trees out to farmers, whether they supply to us or not, because ultimately that's going to help the overall global coffee economy. But we don't necessarily have those relationships, and even if you go out to visit the farm, it can take you 2 hours to get from our farm to another farm on a bumpy road on the back of a truck. And so we've partnered with Conservation International as well as Ecom Agro-Industrial Group, who have kind of centralized and regionalized supply chains where they do distribute those commodities already. And how do we leverage those relationships to get those trees to farmers, which ultimately helps us in our overall goal.
So I want to go to questions from the audience, and because I can keep asking questions all day, but I suspect you've got a few. So great, John, we have one right in the front here. So, and then raise your hands if you're going to have some others be thinking about it. Okay, great.
Thank you. John Townsend, this is a question for Lauren, and we do wish you on-time delivery.
Thank you.
One of the things that is remarkable, I work in New York, and there's a Starbucks virtually every 2 or 3 blocks. And we'd like to have family planning and reproductive health supplies really close to the consumer as well. How do you approach both competition and location of sites to ensure that the coffee is synonymous with Starbucks, it has an identity, but there's lots of competition, and so you also want other people in the market to keep the interest in coffee, whether they go to your place or another's?
Absolutely. So we have noticed that, especially where you do see stores right next to each other, we started that model, I think it was early 2000s, and actually you'd think, why would you have a Starbucks across the street from each other? But in reality, what we found is that having that coffee culture in the area brought more people in. It also allowed us to leverage our scale. So if a store's out of milk, they can call the store next door and they can share milk. So that also helps from a supply chain standpoint to keep inventories low, but also have the product available in some of those regions. So absolutely has been a huge strategic play for us.
I've had more than one experience of saying I'm meeting somebody at a Starbucks, and we're at Starbucks, it's like, where are you? You didn't show, and we were at Starbucks, 50
Across
feet
the
away
street.
from each other, exactly. There's that classic, I don't know how many of you saw the Shrek movie, where they, things are falling down and they run out of one Starbucks across the street into another one. It's one of my favorite scenes. So, okay, so we got one right here, great, and then we'll go in the back there, okay?
Thank you. My name is Fabio Castaño from Management Sciences for Health. Data is a big issue for all of us here in this room. Not only availability of data, but also quality of data. So it seems like you guys have mastered data, to open stores, to close stores, for shipping. Samson mentioned data analytics. So tell us something about how you do it.
That was actually one of the questions, yeah. Who wants to say how
And
they
that's
do
in
it?
regards to the data.
Data in general,
Data
how
capture.
you use it for decision making.
In our world, as a logistics provider, we get the information really in two parts. It's either electronically given to us through, let's say, EDI or some type of file exchange, or it's manually keyed in. There's still parts of the world that just do not have the technology, but they're able to at least type the data in into some type of device that we can get back. What I found kind of in my experience with Village Reach is the data within the traditional logistics world can only go so far. But then you get to the last mile where it becomes very difficult. You may not have devices, you may not have electricity. And this is more of a complex logistics issue that you all face, whereas Village Reach is trying to figure out different ways of capturing data. And that's the challenge. It's that last mile connecting with the traditional logistics side, I would say.
So if I understand the question, it was the availability and the quality of data. Is that correct? Great. So Lauren and we were just talking about this. It's interesting to bring this up. Data is critical for our business, and something that I would suggest is just the foundation of the data schema. One of the challenges we have right now is sometimes our systems don't talk to each other because the way in which we organize the data is incongruent. So one of the suggestions I would have, and this is just learning so we could scale, was we kept the way in which the foundation of the data needs to be the same. So however you're defining the data, the inputs, trying to keep it simple, not complex. Samson and I were talking about SAP, which we use a lot for Microsoft. And one of the challenges we have sometimes is customizing our data too much so that we can't scale. So now we're going back and making it so we can do an out-of-box SAP implementation where we're leveraging, I want to say, vanilla or easy schemas that can integrate with each other. If you can get agreement with your partners and your suppliers and keeping your data simple, it's something that's going to be so much easier, because if not, you're going to be something like Microsoft where we have to go back in order to go forward with our data.
And I would just add, one of the things we did is we worked with our suppliers to make sure we were leveraging the same tools where possible. Obviously, not everybody's going to have the same instance of SAP and all that, but even how we got information from an Expeditors or whoever it was, we would work together to make sure that when we needed to take information from different sources, we could do it easier. If every supplier and every partner is using a different system, it's very hard to do that. So we would actually review this with our customers to figure out, or with our partners and suppliers, how can we get you to use the same systems we have, or vice versa, depending on what the system was and what the long-term value of that system was, right?
Interesting if there's something collectively the coalition could drive. So we have a question, I know, who has the microphone back there? There we go, great.
Good morning. Thanks for talking to us.
Then we'll come over
I heard every one of you talk a little bit about planning for disruption ahead of time, mitigation, pre-mitigation almost, like before it happens, you're already waiting for that disruption to happen. You know it's going to come, whether it's going to cost you $3 billion or whatever. $3 billion, was that really? Did you say B, Samson?
Yeah.
With a B.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I have to take a breath.
I know.
So I was wondering, you have to then sell this to upper management, right? Because mitigation comes at a cost. So what are some successful strategies for making the business case to your upper management to pay for these solving these problems before they happen, and maybe you get lucky and they don't happen? Then what do you say to your upper management to give us the money to do this?
Yeah, I mean, There's a couple of ways we've done it. Unfortunately, in some cases, we experience it in some way first, and not at that magnitude. And we just take something very small and say, look, we had an issue here, we were able to quickly mitigate it, but had we not done that, or this is the full magnitude of this problem, and we can get some buy-off from management that way. Another way is actually looking at the industry and how other companies have been impacted. We see some of our competition have issues that maybe we didn't experience and it was isolated to them, but we take that lesson and we actually put it together as a business case and say, look, here's what we learned from that. Here's how they had to react to it because they weren't proactive, but you know, if we had this technology or whatever it may be, we would have avoided it. One great example of this is tracking. This might not be applicable to everybody, but we track our product now using Internet of Things. We know, and control tower and things like that, we know where our product is at all times, whether it's on the water or on a plane. It sounds like it's very expensive, right? We were able to leverage some of the other business cases and some of the issues that we faced to take that, present it to our management, and they actually said we should invest in it. And we didn't just spend a lot of money on it initially. You do it small, right? So you see, how do you find an inexpensive way to track that information and get the same value out of it without just making a big investment up front. So I'd say leveraging our just industry examples we have, and then in some cases taking issues we've actually faced firsthand at a smaller scale, and then giving that information to our management so they understood what we can do to mitigate it, and then based on those examples, they were able to fund it or make those decisions.
In this case, it would be making the case to the funders. There's no, management doesn't have the money. I think, Angela, you wanted to
Yeah,
add
so just so I understand the question, is like you come up with a mitigation plan, and how do you then sell that mitigation plan to your executives? And if I understand correctly, for me, it's pretty easy. You share them the cost if you don't. So it's, I don't know, we get so much mail at Microsoft, I'm sure you do as well. Numbers usually do the talking. And what we do is we very much show if we don't have a mitigation plan, the impact to the customer, there's a huge cost to that because we have competitors that will take our market share. So for us, how we actually, it's very easy. You show the cost of not having a plan. I want to share a story, one step that's also important when you have a mitigation plan. Make sure it's easy to use. We used to create playbooks where we would say, okay, if this risk happens, here's all the procedures we're going to go out and do. And if nobody knows how to actually mitigate the risk, they don't understand the playbook, and you make it too complicated, then you're never going to be able to mitigate the risk. So that's one of the challenges we had. We had all these great mitigation plans for all these risks, and then when the risk actually occurred or the issue happened, we never implemented it because it was too complex.
And if I could just add, in the academic world and in the logistics world in general, this notion of supply chain disruptors or disruption has gained a lot of momentum in the last 5 years, primarily because we have seen over the last 5 to 6 years some fairly significant events that have significantly impacted many supply chains around the globe. Primarily because there's a lot of concentration now, either in terms of volume on a particular carrier or through particular ports. And that's causing a lot of rethink in terms of how do you lay out your supply chain to mitigate that risk. One very simple way I would encourage all of you is to get to know your providers. Have that relationship. You want to know how they're able to work with you and help you at all times, because events occur. And you need somebody to reach out to and help you.
Great. I think the next question is right here. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Sunita Sharma. I'm the Director of Health Policy Plus project with Palladium. And my question is, do you face legal regulatory policy barriers to market entry or expansion? And what is your approach? Like how do you analyze information and how you really talk to or dialogue with ministry and addressing some of those barriers, like your experience, if you can share, that'll be great.
I have an example. We had a product we launched where we were just trying to determine whether we should manufacture the product locally or import it from, let's say, China, right? And we've done both. And we proposed, we did a full analysis, so we worked with our finance team to understand what's the impact of doing it local or importing it. And we had to really work with trade and the customs and the government officials of that country, because they had a very complex tax structure. So what we realized is we thought initially that local manufacturing was the right thing. When we really spent more time understanding the tax implications and how they had like this elevated tax and how it was taxed on something, and then that was the total cost, and then it was taxed again on that total cost. You know, it wasn't like just one big tax. Which, you know,
Nobody has had that experience.
So what we realized, though, is working through it, we just did a full analysis of here's how much it would cost for both, and one of the things that we looked at is how difficult would it be. Like manufacturing is very difficult. It costs a lot of, it's not even the money, it's the time, the investment, the risk if you get the product demand wrong. Whether it's import, you know you can control it. So we ended up going with that import strategy for that country. And it was just really collecting the data and then making sure we worked with the right people to understand the true impact of our product. And we leveraged, our suppliers actually had done the same analysis for other companies actually, right? So they were able to tell us what were some of the pitfalls. And I think that helped us actually do it faster, which was good.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree with this. So your question is like, how do we get beyond these barriers with tax and legal with different countries? And this is actually going to be kudos to Expeditors. Actually, sometimes we leverage logistic companies to tell us how to do it. Sometimes we get too much information. I mean, we have a pretty big legal department, if you can imagine. We have a trade department as well, but a lot of times it's the logistic partners on the ground that actually know more than we do about how to get into country and out of country for that matter. And so a lot of times, again, it goes back to understanding what your partners are really good at, and I know that I've used Expeditors on multiple occasions, asking like, I understand this is how it reads, but what do we really need to do in order to get into this country for our product?
And if I could just add, thank you for the advertising, but I would encourage all of you to look at your logistics providers as an avenue to help you. With one caveat, make sure that logistics provider understands compliance and regulations. Yes. Those regulations on the world trade side are daunting. Yes. They start from the manufacturing side of what you can and cannot make and bring into a country, all the way through what can or cannot be carried on aircraft, to what is actually cleared within a country and the information that is required upon clearance. Your logistics provider can help you in that. And this is where I would encourage you to have that partnership relationship. But it does start with you looking at that provider, and does that provider have the compliance and the regulatory knowledge for your needs? And that's going to be critical.
I would just add to that, and Samson, you alluded to this. A lot of times your suppliers may know, or your vendors may know the business or may know the competition a lot better than you do. So we also leverage our suppliers as our partners to help us understand what the best way to go to market is.
So I know that there are more questions here, and I suspect all of you now, after that last question, are going to want John's cell phone number, and I'm sure he's going to provide it, so you can call with all of your logistics questions as you after you leave here today. But so I hope this has sort of opened some minds to ways that there are lessons to be learned and information to share that we and a lot of the issues are similar. And I know that there are a lot of differences as well. I mean, in terms of going to management and asking to expand your budget, for example, or things like that. But I think the mechanisms that they've all been talking about are really important to think about. And then thinking about that leveraging of the partnerships, right? And it may sometimes be with your competitors to ensure that end goal, right? What you're all trying to get to in the long run can be achieved. So I'd like to thank our panelists so very much for doing this, and again to Deborah. And have a great day, everybody.